Hi, everyone. Welcome to this seminar in the Human Evolution in the Palaeolithic series. I'm really delighted today to welcome everyone here in the audience and online to hear our speaker, Dr. Patrick Roberts, who's from the Max Planck Institute for Geoanthropology in Jena, Germany. He's come here today to give us a talk, which you can see the title of behind me. For those of you that don't know Patrick, he's a real rising star. Actually, he's not even rising. He really is a star in the world of archaeological science. Patrick was a student at the University of Oxford, where he read a BA in Arch and Anth, and then he went on to do an MSc in archaeological science. And then he went on to do a DPhil in archaeological science as well, all at the same university, which is where we got to know each other. And since then, Patrick in 2016, he went to the Max Planck in Jena, where he's been working since. And while he's been there, he's been now elevated to the position of W2 group leader. And so he has his own research group, and he also has an ERC grant, which focuses on some of the aspects of the work he's going to be talking about today. And finally, Patrick also has written a very nice popular book called Jungle: How Tropical Rainforests Shaped the World and Us, which was published in 2021 out of Viking Random House. And so Patrick is somebody who has worked greatly in a wide variety of fields in archaeological science, principally in stable isotope analysis. So he's someone who's well-versed in looking at the types of methods that are used in understanding aspects of human evolution. And I should also add that in 2021, Patrick was awarded the Heinz Meyer Leibniz Prize. This is the top award for early scientists in Germany, and it's the first time anybody's been awarded this in the field of archaeology. So we're really delighted to welcome Patrick here. Looking forward to his talk. And as usual, at the end, we'll have time for questions. So think of any questions that you might have, and we'll address those at the end. Patrick, over to you, and thank you so much for coming.
Great, thanks so much. First of all, thanks to Tom and Katerina for the kind invitation to have me in this wonderful center, and thank you to me for organizing everything with the visit. So I guess in the Human Evolutionary Seminar Series, what I want to talk about is how we define our species, right? And I'm sure you've heard a number of talks about looking at the origins and evolution of our species in different ways. One of the classic ways, of course, is our skeletal morphology. So this kind of change in skull shape is the kind of classic example. So from, perhaps the Neanderthal example on the left to this more globular brain case, this flatter brow on the right. And so this has, since the discovery of our species in the fossil record, been kind of the traditional way to define how we came into being. There are obviously a few problems with this as a practical tool in archaeology, one of them being that there aren't very many of these skulls. So it's very hard to sort of pinpoint the exact timing and where in Africa, for example, our species begins. And so that can make things difficult using just skeletal morphology alone. In the last probably couple of decades, there's obviously been, as I don't need to say here, huge advances in ancient DNA that have provided new ways to look at what it means to be human, although these have in many ways also complicated the description of what it actually means to be human, showing interbreeding between different hominin species. And this has been also further complicated by discovery of new hominin species that Tom's obviously written about in his great popular book as well. So just an example on the right-hand side here, Homo luzonensis in the Philippines. And so finally, probably the most widely used way to look at the origins of our species is in fact the archaeological record itself. So looking at different types of material culture, be it discussions of symbolic material culture like shell beads, or particular types of technology, so organic bone tools or harpoons, or even the origins of things like the bow and arrow. Commonly looked to when do these types of technologies or material culture appear in the archaeological record, and how do they change through time? Though again, one of the problems here is that actually it's increasingly being understood that more of our hominin relatives could actually do many of these things as well. And of course, they too, like our skeletal morphology, face the same kind of taphonomic issue that we will probably never find the oldest example of these tools in many cases, simply because they're organic, and therefore making it still perhaps potentially difficult to explore the origins of our species in this regard as well. And so what I want to really focus on in this talk is looking at perhaps the more environmental and ecological focus or origins of our species. So you'll often see papers in Nature or Science looking at the earliest human fossil outside of Africa, perhaps. For example, recently this find in Mislea Cave in Israel, dating back to nearly 180, 190,000 years ago, and also more recently examples from Greece as well. But what does it mean to actually get out of Africa? To us, that obviously sounds very big and significant, but actually these political boundaries, of course, did not exist in the past. And so would a hominin moving outside of Africa actually have even noticed it in the past? And I think this is a key point because as you can see from here, at certain periods of time, it would simply have just involved a range expansion, which any species can do. It's not particularly impressive. Any species, be it a bacterium or various types of mammals or birds or fish, would expand their range if they could. And so getting out of Africa is not necessarily that impressive if we don't have the environmental context to really understand what that means. In fact, arguably moving in and around Africa could be far more significant in terms of adaptive traits than actually getting beyond the continent. And indeed, I also argue that looking at these environmental and ecological contexts is particularly significant when we look at the origins of our species. And this is because ever since Charles Darwin, the actual original understanding of what a species is was heavily focused on ecological change, the idea of geographical separation, ecological separation, leading to these evolutionary traits. And so perhaps it is surprising in many ways that the literature in this regard is more focused on the fossils, the material culture, and even arguably the genomes than it is on the environmental and ecological context of these things, because that is arguably what is most significant when we're talking about evolution, at least in the early beginnings of human history. And what I would say is particularly interesting in this context is, as you can see here, our species is emerging at a particularly interesting time in the Pleistocene. There's been growing arguments that hominin evolution, instead of being driven by this kind of increasingly focused adaptation to savanna ecosystems, was in fact rather driven by variability. This idea of swinging between climatic states, particularly during glacial cycles in the Pleistocene. And what you can see up here in the last sort of 200, 300,000 years is that our species was emerging onto the planet about 300,000 years ago at a time when glacial interglacial swings were perhaps less frequent, but were more pronounced, more significant. And so this is the kind of climatic environmental context that our species is moving into. And also in that context, looking back from today onto the process of human evolution, what we can say is that our species is undoubtedly, at least as far as evidence currently provides, the only hominin species that was eventually able to adapt to all of the different environments on land that the world has to offer. So this seems to be a sort of smoking gun. What is unique about our species in this regard? And how far does this kind of go back? Does this go back into the Pleistocene when we first appeared? And perhaps to place this in the most unique context is also important to look at what other hominins were doing, right? Our closest relatives, our closest predecessors as well. In Europe, the classic example is obviously the Neanderthals. And very sort of early on, since their earliest discovery, it's often been argued that they were particularly adapted to extreme cold with their sort of morphology, these kind of barrel chests, and their sort of shape being argued to be a very specialized way of dealing with very cold conditions. But actually, when we look at the paleoenvironmental record of Neanderthals, what we see is actually something far more complex. They were adapted to lots of very different environments, but there is a kind of common thread that goes throughout, whether this was in the sort of Levant region, whether this was in the Mediterranean, whether in temperate Europe. One thing that is almost clear every single time we have environmental records for Neanderthals is that it was a mixture of more open and forested habitats. They were really making use of kind of mosaic environments and the resources available from both of them. We also know they were now doing far more complex things than we previously thought. They're making use of marine mammals, shellfish that they would arguably even had to dive for. And so our understanding of what these hominins were able to do is now far more developed than it ever has been in the past. But again, what I think is interesting and sort of keep this in mind is that there's often evidence for these kind of mosaic habitats, that they are using these kind of varied situations wherever they're found in the world, at least to our current knowledge. Another example is Homo erectus. So from 2 million years ago, this is thought to be the sort of earliest hominin that's making it out of Africa. And it turns up in Southeast Asia by about 1.8 million years ago in Indonesia. This is potentially exceedingly interesting because we know today in Southeast Asia, there are tropical rainforest habitats that have been argued to be pretty complex or difficult to adapt to. And we now know that Homo erectus was there from about 1.8 million years ago to maybe as late as 100,000 or just before 100,000 years ago as well. Not just Homo erectus, but also on the island of Flores, Homo floresiensis, or the hobbit, we know was also another hominin emerging in this part of the world, potentially related to Homo erectus. Again, in this case, a very small-bodied hominin. Looking at modern human ecology studies, it's been argued that this small stature may also in turn be linked to tropical forest habitats, with sort of high temperatures and humidity often being linked to hunter-gatherer body shapes around the world today. It's been argued that maybe they were showing a specialized adaptation to tropical forests. But again, actually, I would say in both of these cases, the current evidence we have suggests that actually quite like Neanderthals, both Homo erectus and Homo floresiensis in Southeast Asia were using mosaic habitats. Where we find them, the prevailing evidence suggests they were making use of fringe habitats between grasslands, between woodland, forest areas. Again, taking the opportunities that were available in these very different habitats. And finally, just to move on to the Denisovans, I think a hominin obviously very close to the hearts of people working here. This is a hominin that was first identified from DNA of a finger bone from Denisova cave in Siberia. This hominin is perhaps the prime example, other than our species, that's been argued to maybe have a more complex environmental and ecological history. In particular, most recently, proteomics work has been argued to have shown this hominin was actually living in very high altitude habitats, with genetic work also suggesting that it passed on adaptations to high altitude, low oxygen conditions to our species as well. This does seem to be the sort of, and in addition, also living potentially in tropical contexts with, again, genetic information from Denisovans being passed into also members of our species living in and around this part of the world, suggesting that perhaps it was also living in the tropics as well. So this does seem to be an interesting candidate for having a more diverse ecological history. Although there are two caveats for this. One is that this high altitude example, there still is no direct environmental information, and indeed there are still debates in some quarters as to whether it even comes from that cave, of course, given its origins later. And in the tropical context, there remains to be, as of yet, no direct evidence for the habitats that Denisovans might have been occupying in this part of the world as well. But it does remain a very interesting example moving forward. But anyway, I want to contrast the evidence we have there for the evidence that we have for our own species adaptations during the Pleistocene. As I mentioned before, the adaptation of our species have often been seen, or at least early on was seen as this kind of this final adaptation to savanna ecosystems, that we sort of perfected this ability to hunt the medium to large game that were living in savanna ecosystems. Or alternatively, where we see a lot of the material culture that was once thought to be unique to our species, like art, like symbolic behavior, in caves like Blombos on the southern coast of South Africa. In marine contexts, it's been argued that perhaps protein-rich marine environments provided the ideal mesic settings for our species to emerge and start to experiment technologically and socially. Indeed, assumptions of both of these contexts also have been used to argue how our species then moved beyond Africa. For example, in the savanna context, it's been argued, still is argued in Southeast Asia, that our species only moved into that region during a period when rainforest had retreated, making use of savanna corridors. And similarly, arguments of this Indian Ocean coastal corridor, while probably increasingly discredited, are still prevalent in discussing how our species moved so quickly from Africa round to Australia during the late Pleistocene as well, and indeed into the Americas, as we'll see a little later. What I want to do now, though, is show you that there's actually now evidence from increasingly varied habitats showing that our species, nearly from its earliest origins in Africa, was adapted to very diverse environments as well, not just showing this kind of monolithic focus. The first is an area very close to my heart, which is rainforest. This is where I began my PhD work. We've often had sort of perceptions, at least our popular perception of these environments is that they're very hard to adapt to, that they're wild, primeval settings. Just take books like The Jungle Book, that this is not where people are supposed to live, right? That it's very difficult to extract nutrients and very difficult to live there permanently, as we can see from the ruins in the background of such images like this. Alternatively, they're also very difficult to do archaeological work in. This is a photo from one of my colleagues, Vida Kusmatono from Kalimantan in Borneo. This is the journey the archaeologists had to take just to get to the site every day. And so you can see this is very different to the kind of excavation that's possible to do in Europe. And so they're also understudied from an archaeological perspective as well. And so both of these trends had actually seen for the longest time as seeing them as very sort of difficult environments to imagine the earliest members of our species inside. But in the last sort of few decades, not only has sort of archaeological determination by local researchers in various tropical nations, but also the addition of methodological advances as well. And so one I want to touch upon here, as Tom mentioned, is I've done a lot of work with stable isotope analysis, and particularly what has been useful here is applying stable carbon isotope analysis to these periods in our species origins. So for those of you that don't know, isotopes are atoms of the same element, but with different numbers of neutrons. And what this basically means is that they react in slightly different ways because the heavier isotope is, well, heavier. And so using this very crude animation, what happens is the lighter isotope tends to react faster than the heavier isotope. This is a very crude oversimplification, but basically holds as a basic principle. And so these two isotopes will react differently in different reactions, and by measuring their relationship before and after, we can actually say something about the reaction they've been involved in. And most significant here is photosynthesis. So most plants on the planet can be divided into one of these two categories, C3 or C4. You might have heard of this. It sounds a bit like jargon, but actually all this refers to is the number of carbon atoms in the first sugar produced during photosynthesis. So 3 carbons or 4 carbons. And some of our favorite crops can be divided into these categories. So wheat, for example, is a C3 crop. So is barley, potatoes. In fact, most of the crops are C3, and crops like C4, like maize or millet are C4 crops then. And as you can see, they both have very different stable carbon isotope values as well that allows us to distinguish them. Significantly, this separation doesn't just occur between domesticated crops, but actually also occurs between wild plants, because C3 and C4 plants have very different adaptations as well. And so, for example, in tropical forests, or indeed any forest for that matter, C3 plants really dominate. By contrast, in open tropical grassland systems, C4 grasses operate. And so we can actually use this approach to explore what environments were like in the past and to really test between different types of ecological adaptation as well. Within C3 forests, we can use this further because actually when you're under a very dense canopy where there's lots of carbon dioxide recycling and limited light availability, this pushes stable carbon isotope values down even further so that we can actually distinguish plants growing in a slightly more open forest and those growing in a slightly more dense forest. So we can apply this approach to tooth enamel, which is preserved over really long periods of time, to basically explore what humans were doing in tropical areas in the past. We can also make use of the fact that tooth enamel grows incrementally, so we can actually even explore this through time as a particular tooth is forming to see if these adaptations change through time as well. And so we applied it. I mean, this was my PhD work was on the island of Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka was really interesting because it's slap bang in the middle of that Indian Ocean or supposed Indian Ocean highway route, right? It's at the tip of India. It's really right in the middle of where this coastal highway should be operating between Africa and Australia. And yet what was fascinating is that Sri Lankan archaeologists as early as the 1980s had been showing that the earliest human fossils and evidence for humans on the island were not found along the coast, were not found in the open grassland areas of the island, but were in fact found in what was today modern rainforest. So this was quite surprising given prevailing arguments at the time, and especially given just how close it would have been to get to the coast or grassland areas as well. And arguments that, the changes in sea level had hidden older sites also didn't really work because of the shape of Sri Lanka's coast means that it drops off very quickly. And so this argument of coastal sort of subsidence doesn't really work. Also at these same sites, there was evidence from bone tools from the animals being found there that the humans at these sites were very much hunting tropical forest animals as well. But still, there were some debates. Given how this was kind of bucking the trend, if you like, there were arguments that, well, maybe there wasn't rainforest there in the past, maybe actually grassland was far more extensive, or alternatively, these were just sort of hunting camps that humans were moving around and just using the forest for parts of the year. And so we wanted to apply this stable isotope method to really try and test this once and for all. So this is a plot of animals living in different parts, different ecosystems in Sri Lanka. Over on the left-hand side, you have dense wet zone rainforest animals. In the orange in the middle, you have slightly more open intermediate rainforest. And then over on the right-hand side towards the top, you have animals that live in grassland. So you can see how stable carbon isotopes are really helping to separate these biomes. So what happens when we then put the humans on top? Well, this was the earliest human sample we had, dating to about 36,000 years ago, probably about 38,000 years ago now. And what you can see is that although the animals at this time were sort of split across these biomes, is that the human itself was actually really making use of rainforest habitats. So it was not only making use of them, it was actually sort of choosing to, if you like, because it could have been over here. And the previous expectation based on Africa was that hominins, whenever they have access to savanna ecosystems with their large game, that they would go there. So it was every expectation that they should be over here, but they weren't. The first human is over there. This continues into the last glacial maximum. The last glacial maximum is interesting because in the tropics, what tends to happen is instead of cold, you get drying. And so forests tend to open up a little bit. And so that's what you can see here. You can see that the animals from the wet zone rainforest have moved over a little bit into the drier area, and that the humans have done likewise. But what is again significant is even during this period where grasslands would be more abundant than ever, none of them are getting over into this space, right? They're still using forests, albeit slightly more open forests. This continues into the terminal Pleistocene, early Holocene, and then in the late Holocene, we sort of have the exception that proves the rule, if you like. These two individuals over here are from the Iron Age, a period when millet, which as I mentioned is a C4 crop, is moving into the rainforest areas of Sri Lanka. So these two individuals are probably making use of farmed C4 crops. And even then, we still have individuals that are choosing to make use of the forest. So, you know, what we had from Sri Lanka is this record of humans not only making use of rainforest habitats very early on in the Pleistocene, but also really choosing to do so. And these are just sequential plots of the teeth that I sort of showed you earlier. And what you can see is this doesn't change during formation of the tooth. That basically the signal is stable. And so it's not that humans were moving around. So this kind of work in Sri Lanka sort of inspired us to kind of look elsewhere. What is the evidence elsewhere for human use of tropical rainforests? Well, in Africa, sort of currently debated evidence is this sort of Lupemban and Sangoan stone tools, these huge, heavy-duty axes that have been argued to maybe be linked to hunting rainforest animals or digging out underground storage organs in the forest as well. And what's interesting is where they're found today is actually along the fringes of tropical rainforests. This is a great paper by Nicholas Taylor, actually, who's done a lot of work on this. But what's interesting is that actually during periods of climate change, the African rainforest is most vulnerable to drying, and so it will retract most quickly. And so actually during this period, these tools could just as easily be outside of the rainforest. So this remains a debated case. Unfortunately, a lot of the sites where these tools are found, there's no organic preservation. Dating is very difficult because they're often open air sites and very highly mobile. And so this really doesn't remain a question up for debate. My opinion is that we will eventually find evidence for early members right back 200,000 years ago of our species using these habitats. But as yet, I think this has to remain sort of discussed as debated. So what about Southeast Asia then? Southeast Asia is interesting because obviously we have hominins since Homo erectus being there from 1.8 million years ago. And as I also mentioned, Southeast Asia is interesting because one of the prevailing hypotheses for hominins getting into the region is during periods when this savanna corridor, that's this shown here, extended all the way down from the mainland into what is today island Southeast Asia. Because at glacial periods, sea level would have declined, and you get this big sunder shelf basically that allows this to sort of potentially extend all this way and even through areas like the Philippines. So my colleague and I, Julian Lewis, in 2020, we tried to combine sort of again using carbon isotopes, all of the available information from animals from Southeast Asia between the early Pleistocene and the late Pleistocene. So all these very different types of animals, primates, large mammals, rodents, and carnivores, just to see exactly what were the trends going on during this interesting period in hominin evolution. So what we can see is when we look at the early Pleistocene, we see that at the time when Homo erectus was getting into there was again a bit of a mix, that there is this very strong likely forest signal over here, but there are also areas of C4 grass. It's certainly not true that it's all one big savanna, but there is certainly more open areas available at that time. As we get into the middle Pleistocene, this is just around when Homo floresiensis and its ancestor is emerging in Flores. We get a big shift over towards more grassland signals. And then in the late Pleistocene, this switches completely back to forest signal again, which continues into the Holocene to this kind of modern rainforest fauna we know in Southeast Asia today that is now obviously being changed by our own activities over the last 50 years. So what we can sort of clearly see from this, one of the arguments is that This period of more open habitat during the earlier Middle Pleistocene really encouraged the hominins to move in there, making use of these mosaic mixed habitats. And what's interesting is that in the late Pleistocene, that's when Homo floresiensis, that's when Homo erectus do finally go extinct. And the human that does seem to emerge at that time is our own. It's our species that seems to get in there from about 70,000 years ago. So we don't have particularly good direct evidence, but on the balance of evidence so far, it seems that our species was able to do something that these other hominins were not in these tropical settings. What we do have good evidence is eventually for our species being able to do just that. The Nia caves in Borneo, for example, we have evidence for our humans hunting wild boar, various primates, and perhaps even making use of toxic plants from about 45,000 years ago. There's also even discussion from 50,000 years ago that humans were deliberately burning forests around the caves to try and create mixtures of forests to boost resource abundance as well. And so certainly by 45,000 years ago, we have clear evidence that our species was doing something in terms of specialized rainforest adaptation in Southeast Asia that our hominin ancestors simply weren't doing. It may be that that now goes back to 70,000 years ago. There's a tooth at Lida Adja in Sumatra that suggests humans, or that tooth is associated with orangutans, but again, there's no direct isotopic evidence or no direct other evidence to really say exactly what it was doing at that time. Moving out into near Oceania in New Guinea, we have evidence for humans up in the Avani Valley at 45,000 years ago as well. It's been argued that it was using axes to sort of cut down trees and exploiting really starch-rich pandanus nuts as well. And what's really interesting about these tropical forests is that they actually get very frosty in winter, and at the last glacial maximum would have actually been incredibly cold. So what this is bringing us is not just a kind of idea that our species could adapt to tropical forests, tropical rainforests, but also very different types of tropical forests, tropical rainforests, because I think we don't appreciate often just how varied these habitats are, but these highland mountainous forests really are something quite different to adapt to say the lowland rainforests of Sri Lanka. That's rainforests, and moving from there, so I think, we found this increasing evidence that seems to hint that our species was really clearly able to adapt to tropical rainforests by the late Pleistocene, perhaps even from its earliest appearance in Africa. So the question is then, well, if we have that evidence from rainforests, what other environments do we have that from? Particularly environments that have been often considered unattractive. So one classic example there is deserts. And so, Mike Petraglia and his team on the Paleo Deserts team have done a lot of work into exploring how deserts in northwestern India, but also particularly Saudi Arabia, have, actually been inhabited by hominin populations in the past. Because again, due to difficulties of fieldwork, due to environmental assumptions, it was thought that maybe hominins wouldn't really want to be here. But actually, when one does the archaeological evidence, look at the archaeological research, one can see that there are actually numerous archaeological sites in areas like Saudi Arabia, and work by Jim Bob Blinkhorn, for example, in Northwest India, and his colleagues there have really shown that there's also be sites there too. And these seem to be appearing at times when climate change would have meant that these areas became green. So what Mike and his team have called sort of green Arabia. So even from kind of quite early on, there's evidence that hominins were getting into this area during periods where there would have been increased rainfall, the development of river and even lake systems. But one question there is, well, how green is green Arabia, right? What are we talking about here? Are we talking about isolated oases that hominins still have to be really sort of develop really specialized adaptations to, or are we talking, again, this same idea as I mentioned earlier, just simply a range expansion, right? Would it have just looked very similar to an Eastern Africa savanna ecosystem? So one site where we can look at this is a site in Tissel Garda, which is in the Nafud Desert up here. This is a Paleo lake site. There used to be a lake that existed just around here in the past. And sort of at this lake site, it's been discovered that there are huge elephants, various animals that were moving around this part of Saudi Arabia in the past. Significantly, there's even evidence for hominin cut marks and stone tools from this site, dating to around about 200, 300,000 years ago. So likely pre-Homo sapiens hominins, although we don't necessarily know for sure, moving in and around this part of the desert in the past. But again, the question is, what kind of conditions were these hominins moving into? And so here I'm going to turn to oxygen isotopes. We talked about carbon isotopes before. Here we have the lighter oxygen 16 isotope and the heavier oxygen 18 isotope. And again, if we think about that kind of idea of lighter isotopes reacting slightly faster, this is perhaps even more intuitive to understand where you have evaporation, you have more of the lighter isotope evaporating than the heavier isotope. So what this means is that your rain clouds that form from a water body have lower values than the water body that's left behind because you have greater proportion of this lighter isotope. These clouds then move inland over the coast, and then when you get rain, you get the opposite factor occurring. You get more of the heavier isotope falling as rain than the lighter isotope, which perhaps makes sense from the basic principle of gravity. And then your vapor left behind has lighter isotopes again. And as these clouds keep moving inland, you get changes as well. What is significant here, though, is that you get your evapotranspiration also occurring in plants once this rain has fallen. And this is very significant because this means that plants where there's heavy evapotranspiration occurring will have higher values because more of the heavier isotope is staying behind than the water around them. And so we can use this principle to look at animals called obligate drinkers and non-obligate drinkers. So we are obligate drinkers. We have to get our water from water sources. We drink tap water, whatever. But there are other animals called non-obligate drinkers. This is like the Arabian oryx here. Ostriches are also non-obligate drinkers. They can actually get their water from plants. By eating plant material, they get enough water to survive. And so we can actually compare the oxygen isotope values of these non-obligate drinkers to obligate drinkers, in this case horses, to try and get some insights into the environmental aridity that are occurring. So this is some work we did at HEAS Seminar. These are two modern African areas. So what you see here is you get obligate drinkers. They have slightly lower values than the non-obligate drinkers. As I mentioned, this is because of the evapotranspiration from plants. So the plant water has higher values than the groundwater that's being drunk by obligate drinkers. The same as at Savo. So what we can say is there is some aridity here, right? Because there are higher values in the plants, higher values in the animals eating those plants than there are in the others. This is modern Arabia. So you can see that this is in huge amounts of aridity, as we would expect, right? There's a huge gap between our non-obligate drinkers and our obligate drinkers. These are the animals from HEAS Seminar. So what you can see is it certainly isn't like a modern Arabian context. In fact, it's most similar to an East African savanna. So in other words, I would argue that these hominins 300,000 years ago at HEAS Seminar were basically just undertaking a range expansion. Basically, they had similar environments to what they were experiencing in Eastern Africa. And so what we think these pre-Homo sapiens populations were actually just moving into Arabia at a time when conditions were very similar to how they were in Africa. So I think, just again, trying to highlight how these records are really significant for exploring what adaptations, what mobility means in the past. Work by Matthew Stewart. He's currently a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute as well. He's been doing work on to then what do assemblages look like in then the eventual Homo sapiens sites in Arabia. And the evidence he's finding so far suggests that things might have been slightly more arid. He's finding lots more of these gazelles. These are really arid adapted animals. And so the hints currently, although we haven't got enough sample size to try the same method that we did at HEAS Seminar, are preliminarily hinting that humans are getting into this setting when it's more arid than it was for their predecessors. There are other desert areas where these questions remain open. For example, in North Africa, Ellie Sherry's done this review of lots of sites existing across the Sahara during the Pleistocene. Again, it seems that these sites were occupied during wetter periods. But again, what does that mean? Is it enough just to have a sort of small stream, a small oasis that still requires a really significant adaptation, or is it just part of a range expansion? That remains up for debate, I think, currently. There are no good records, environmental records from that part of Africa just yet. A really interesting case is from Namibia, where it's been shown that Homo sapiens using Middle Stone Age technology are living around the Okavango Delta at a time when things are actually drying. So the climatic record from this lake suggests that things are getting really dry. And yet this is just the time when people are appearing here with their Middle Stone Age technology. So it does appear to be a clear case of humans actually showing a really sophisticated adaptation at this time. As I mentioned, there's also work by Jim Bob Blinkhorn, who's been looking at this question in northwestern India as well. There are growing paleoenvironmental records that again might hint that earlier hominins, potentially Homo erectus, potentially Neanderthals, are using this part of the Thar Desert when there's far greater water flow than later when humans are in it. But again, the records are not great. So this remains, again, still to be debated, I would say. Finally, there's the interesting case of the Gobi Desert. Discussions of human arrival in China usually follow this discussion of either, this very early arrival through the southern regions, so coming up, interestingly, in the tropical rainforest areas of the region, or later moving really north through Siberia and then coming back down into eastern China. The Gobi Desert here has been relatively ignored as a kind of impassable barrier. But actually here too, it's possible that in the past climate change may have meant that lake systems would have been more significant, that actually hominins with the right adaptations could be moving through in a far more direct manner, potentially interacting as well, Homo sapiens interacting with Denisovans during this time as well. So I think this is also an interesting area to explore from this perspective. But again, the current paleoenvironmental records mean this is up for debate, I would say. So moving away from deserts to a different sort of type of further extreme environment, there have been discussions that human populations were north of the Arctic Circle, potentially by 45,000 years ago, evidence on cut-mark bone from Siberia, although this remains a little bit disputed. Certainly a little later, by 20,000 or so years ago, there's evidence for a really strong adaptation to hunting mammoths, basically mammoths being able to get through frost and access rich nutrients of grassland, and human populations then really focusing on hunting them and even turning them into houses as well. So there's interesting hints that of really sort of ability to adapt to extreme cold there. I mentioned earlier, this is something that obviously Tom and his team have been working on too, is arrival in the Americas. And so question here is what adaptations did this involve? Often discussed that because this must have been an ice corridor at a certain point in the past, that humans must have been coming in via the coast. Increasingly hints that there may have been earlier and earlier arrivals, whether that's 30,000 years ago in Mexico now, 20,000 years ago in South America. Still an area of intense debate, I would say. And also there remains the possibility, well, maybe humans could actually adapt to this area when it was quite cold. If we do find evidence for them being able to follow large mammals who are able to extract nutrients even from relatively frosty areas, it is possible potentially that they're also coming directly across this corridor at periods maybe earlier than we would have expected. So I think this is still an area open for discussion as well. Interestingly, in Germany as well, we're working with a team at this site of Breitenbach, which is an upper Pleistocene, not a late Pleistocene site, upper Paleolithic, which has these remarkable Venus figurines at an area that's right on the boundary of where the glaciers came down during the last glacial period, and actually evidence that humans were living here right at this boundary when glaciers were getting towards their peak. And it seems that humans were coming up here to really specialize focus on hunting reindeer. And so even in Europe, we have hints that humans were really doing something really quite extreme, perhaps in areas that were really cold at times as well. And so the final sort of extreme environment I want to discuss is mountains. So here we have, this is Lesotho. We have humans also evidenced at quite high altitude areas during the late Pleistocene as well. Lesotho is particularly interesting because basically most of all of its land is above 1,700 meters. So in effect, all of it is a mountain, and most of it is actually above 2,500 meters as well. So it's really quite high. In sort of human ecology discussions, mountainous areas have been considered to be quite unattractive in terms of really being quite scrubby, really specially adapted fauna that isn't potentially particularly productive. And so it's also been considered sort of like rainforests as fairly unattractive. And yet what we have here is we actually have humans living in what can be seen here as really rugged areas as early at the site of Medicane, as early as about 70,000, 80,000 years ago. We also have evidence again from stable isotopes. Here, this is doing something slightly different. Instead of in tropical forests where you have C3 forests versus C4 grasses, in high altitude areas, what you tend to have is C3 grasses that are really adapted to cold conditions. So they live sort of up on the higher ends of the mountain, and C4 grasses, which are tropical grasses, which much prefer the warmer conditions lower down. And through time, if they're sort of fluctuating, the amount of these grasses through time, we know the temperature's changing, that basically if C4 grasses go up the mountain, things are getting warmer. If they go down, then things are getting colder. So if we analyze sediments, animal, tooth enamel from a given archaeological site, we can explore how temperature is changing through time. And so what we see from sites in Lesotho, for example, is that humans are actually staying there through really quite cold periods, including the last glacial maximum. And what we think they're doing here is because actually it was a really important source of fresh water, right? If you're up on a mountain, you have guaranteed access to water from streams, from rivers. There's also evidence they may have been fishing quite significantly, so even a reliable source of protein. But what's significant is that around Lesotho, during these glacial periods, you end up with drying. And actually that is far more problematic in terms of getting access to water than cold. And so clearly humans are forming a bit of a reliance on areas like Lesotho due simply to water access as well. There's also evidence in Ethiopia about 80,000 years ago for humans living really high in the Bale Mountains. Again, in quite scrubby areas, areas like this is what the environment looks like today. And based on the zooarchaeology, it seems they were developing a really specialized focus on these guys, mole rats, and that this was really supporting them to live in these high altitude areas that early as well. We also have evidence for humans being on the Tibetan Plateau 40 to 30,000 years ago. Again, we don't have particularly great environmental records, but most likely this was a fairly hostile environment at that time, but more work needs to be done there. And also when humans arrive in South America, they get very quickly up into the high Andes by about 13,000 years ago. And then humans living in this area today now show genetic adaptations to deal with low oxygen conditions as well. But this is happening really quite quickly, depending on when we think humans arrive in South America. But currently, it seems that they're getting up into the Andes really quite quickly. And so in a paper in 2018, this gets back to the sort of title of my presentation, myself and a colleague, Brian Stewart, we argued that this evidence from the late Pleistocene is evidence for a new ecological niche for our species. To throw a bit more jargon out into the literature, we called this the generalist specialist. And what we meant by this is you have specialists like pandas, right? They eat bamboo, they all eat bamboo. Every individual, every population of pandas, they all do the same thing. They are specialists. Then you have generalists, which is what people have often called our hominin ancestors, like Homo erectus. Here, like raccoons is another classic example. Here you have as a population, as a species as a whole, they all do very different things. You might have a population of raccoons in a woodland. You might have some of them living out of trash cans in a city. They're really flexible, but as a whole, it seems to be a bit of a mishmash. The whole population is sort of doing this. And what we were arguing is what there is evidence for in our species is a bit of both of these things. As a generalist, we're living in every single terrestrial environment as early as the late Pleistocene, as far as we can tell. But not only that, but there are populations of our species that are specializing in these environments. So in Sri Lanka, from 45,000 to 3,000 years ago, we have people living in the rainforest, basically doing the same thing for all that period of time. Even as other populations are somewhere up in a mountain, there are other populations up in the cold. There are others, of course, on the coast in savanna ecosystems. And this would have provided potentially major competitive advantage, right? That as something like climate change may have impacted one habitat, populations of our species are still going to be able to do really well in a different habitat. So it's this kind of combination of being able to generalize as a species across the planet as a whole, but also having populations that can really develop specialized adaptations to particular regions as well. And this seems to be relatively unique in the context of the hominin lineage, at least so far. And so just again, going back to tropical forests to exemplify this, as I sort of briefly mentioned earlier, we tend to think that tropical forests are all this, big tropical rainforest, lowland tropical rainforest, but actually they're this. They are lowland tropical rainforests, but there are also montane rainforests like this that can get ice in winter. There are swamp forests like this, and there are even dry tropical forests that can lose their leaves part of the year. They are very different habitats. And so we not only have evidence for our species living in this, but also all of this by the late Pleistocene. And I think this sort of exemplifies what we mean by this generalist specialist kind of idea, both showing flexibility to adapt to tropical rainforests, but also populations living in very different habitats as well at the same time. So just to leave some questions then, this is sort of the hypothesis. And actually, to be honest, the aim of this hypothesis was not really necessarily to be right. We're quite happy to be proven wrong, but rather to get people to look at the environmental context of their finds, right? That when they find the earliest human outside of Africa, well, what environment is it in? Because really from an evolutionary perspective, that is what is important. When we find sort of early interesting new genomic information, what is the environmental context with which that is being found? Because again, that might provide more clues into adaptive change as well. But currently, on the basis of the evidence, I would argue that it does still seem to be the case that Homo sapiens is doing something unique in the late Pleistocene compared to other hominins. One candidate I mentioned that may sort of contest this is particularly Denisovans. We have them up in high altitude areas currently, as well as in tropical regions. One sort of really significant piece of data here has been argued that some of the genome of humans living in this part of Asia was passed from Denisovans, and so it's argued that Denisovans had this high altitude adaptation. If one was to play devil's advocate, one could say, well, that information could have been passed to humans and then only selected for later when Homo sapiens was living in these high altitude settings. So it's not necessarily direct proof just yet. And again, as I mentioned, you could argue what kinds of environments these were at 3,000 meters as well. But it does seem to be a potentially really interesting candidate for a hominin that does seem to be doing something a little bit different to the others. And as I mentioned, there's potentially evidence that Denisovans is living in the tropics at this time as well. What kind of environments is associated with it? In the future, will we see that Denisovans were living in tropical rainforests, were able to specialize in using these habitats to a similar way as our own? I think this is a really interesting, open remaining question that I know Katerina and her team are looking at as well. In terms of Neanderthals, it's another interesting case. There are suggestions that Neanderthals may have been inhabiting quite extreme environments in parts of Europe, maybe when it was quite cold. Although I would say that the latest oxygen isotope evidence from people like Sarah Pedizani is showing that humans, when they get into Europe, are adapting to a whole new different type of cold than Neanderthals were. So I think currently, on the basis, it still seems to be the case that Homo sapiens are doing something a little bit interesting, but it does remain a sort of area for interest. Another question in this regard, so where should we look to try and test this hypothesis further? So I'm part of a project called the Last Journey ELC project, headed by Jose Iriarte at the University of Exeter. This is looking kind of in Colombia in particular at humans arriving in South America, because what is quite fascinating, this is sort of the last continent other than Antarctica that humans get into in the Pleistocene. It's also a continent that has really high altitude mountains, it has deserts, has tropical rainforest, and significantly humans are hitting these environments basically as soon as they get into this continent. So it's an ideal place to explore, well, how fast did human populations adapt to these? Did they really divide up and get into these very specialized adaptations very quickly? What impacts did that have on plants and animals? So I think this is a really interesting case to test whether this hypothesis works. And of course, the other beauty of it is we can look anywhere for it, right? The whole point is that Homo sapiens seem to be doing something in terms of their inhabitation of very different environments. In an ideal world, what we are able to do is explore it where we have different hominins and Homo sapiens in a similar geographical space. Are they doing something different? Are they doing the same thing? I think it's a super interesting area for exploration, but what it means is that, of course, if what makes us human is indeed our ability to inhabit all of these different ecologies, then the place to prove that is in fact the whole world, right? There are also some interesting caveats potentially here that based on the majority of evidence, one issue is that for hominins other than Homo sapiens, a lot of the sites we have evidence for are open air sites. So particularly in Africa, it's a lot of lakeside sites. This is also open air sites. This continues to be the case even out of Africa. By contrast, we have a lot of cave sites for our own species. So this could be biasing the record, right? That we're getting much better preservation for Homo sapiens, which is meaning that we can explore details about what they were doing to a better degree than we can other hominins. So it might be that we have a bit of an unfair bias here. One thing I would say is that we do have caves for some other hominins. We do have, in Flores, for example, Liang Bua for Homo floresiensis. We do have Wunderwerk Cave also in South Africa. And currently there is no evidence, again, that still it seems to fit with the broader picture, but this is something worth bearing in mind, at least in the distribution of our data set at present. The other interesting question is this doesn't necessarily explain everything, right? All this is an observation that Homo sapiens is in different environments potentially than other hominins. It doesn't explain why. It doesn't explain necessarily what drove it. One thing that I think is super interesting here is that this is part of an increasing discussion of ecological plasticity. So instead of this kind of progression along savanna ecosystems or increasing adaptations to the coast, discussions of hominin evolution now focusing on plasticity ever since the work of people like Rick Potts, Matt Grove have also made similar arguments. And what's super interesting is that this term plasticity is also appearing in other areas of human evolution. It's appearing in neuroscience, the idea that the human brain is not necessarily so different because of any absolute change, but rather with the ability for it to change during life, with the ability to make new connections between areas as well. Similarly, a new area of focus is this idea of cumulative knowledge, that humans have this great ability to pass on knowledge through generations, potentially around things like the fireplace. This would have provided a really important source of ability to adapt to new extreme environments very quickly, right? So this could have had something to do with it. Social connections would have also been significant, right? If we have populations really specializing in different environments, should anything go wrong in those environments, then some kind of social buffer would also have been important. Also, new technologies like the bow and arrow, which does seem to be unique to our species currently, would have provided an effective way to adapt to these different environments too. So I think the nice thing about this hypothesis, it doesn't necessarily, it's not saying that everything's about environment, everything's about ecology, it's only using that as an observation. You know, still all of these different areas for discussing what is unique about humans remain important to explore. And here, going back to Sri Lanka, I think is a particularly interesting case here, because as I mentioned, our isotopic evidence shows that we do have people living in the rainforest pretty much permanently full-time between 45,000, 3,000 years ago. But also at these rainforest sites, we have finds like these. These are actually marine shell beads, and we also have shark teeth. Now, if the humans aren't moving, that means that they must be trading with a group that's on the coast. So actually what we have is this sort of generalist specialist in miniature, if you like, that there is a population living on the coast of Sri Lanka that these rainforest groups are trading with. So I think showing how important these social connections might have been between groups, really showing ecological specialization. And just finally, how can we study it? I think one of the areas that makes this ecological environmental focus so interesting is that the records do not face the same taphonomic issue as things like paleoanthropology, that a lot of the proxies we use to explore the environment exist all the way back for millions of years. So actually we can put all hominins on the same scale. Yes, there might be different degrees of resolution, but actually we can compare hominins on a sort of like for like basis, which isn't always the case, as I mentioned right at the start of this talk. So we can use things like isotope analysis of tooth enamel, hominin tooth enamel associated animal tooth enamel. This method goes back to 7 million years ago. So we can explore animal diets, animal environments back that far. Things like zooms that's obviously being done significantly here can help us get zooarchaeological information even where preservation isn't great as well. Botanical records, be that pollen, be it charred plant remains, these also extend back a significant way in time. What plants were different hominins using at different points in time? And also climate environmental proxy records. Again, I would debate the degree to which perhaps a marine core is always going to be relevant for particular local hominin activities. But again, these records often go back millions or at least hundreds of thousands of years. So important to put hominins on the same kind of scale of change. Here, I just wanted to touch upon some work that's going on in our own institute. We're delighted to now have Nicolas Bourgeon working in our research group. So he's applying zinc isotopes. One of the issues we've often had in terms of exploring hominin adaptations, particularly in the tropics, but also back further in time, is that collagen isn't preserved, right? Collagen's quite nice because it gives us not only the carbon isotopes I've shown, but also the nitrogen isotopes, which can be used to look at things like trophic level, the amounts of meat consumption, potentially freshwater fish consumption. So we've been lacking that information. We can sort of say things about environment, but not anything more specific than that. Well, zinc isotopes is potentially beginning to change that because this is from tooth enamel, but it also gives insights into trophic level. More recently, work that also Nick's been a part of is also nitrogen isotopes trapped in tooth enamel, so that actually you can get the same signal that you're getting from collagen back over much greater time distances as well. So this is a really exciting development and may provide us even more resolution into what different hominins are doing in the past as well. Also, I was mentioning before that, you know, the climate records that do go back quite far, it can be a bit of an issue that if they're in marine systems, it's not clear the degree to which marine climate change is going to be relevant to hominins living in a particular part of the landscape. Well, so we're also trying to develop on-site environmental records that we like to call them, where you end up with proxy records from an archaeological site directly associated with material culture, skeletal remains, so that we can directly sort of explore what environments, ecologies were relevant to human populations. One method here is this leaf wax analysis. So leaves, grasses, they produce this kind of waxy cuticular surface, and this preserves really well because they're water resistant. And we can actually measure the isotopes of these waxes to explore things like, again, this C3, C4 question, but also through hydrogen isotope analysis, similar things to the oxygen isotopes. So things like water, aridity through time. And so we can actually start to apply this to archaeological sites to see how climate and environment might change as we see changes in technology, for example. So that's another method we're trying to apply to sort of look at these questions too. And just to finish then, just a couple of final slides is I think this generalist specialist concept is kind of also interesting because it also feeds, you know, as you get population specializing, this also fits into what we then see next, basically, that humans start to not only live in landscapes, but also change them. So now we have the work of Jess Thompson from Malawi. She's already shown that, I guess, as early as 70, 80,000 years ago, humans are already using fire to modify whole river basins in Malawi to potentially change the resources available to them. In the tropics, we have evidence from at least 45,000 years ago of humans burning forests to try and change the structure of these forests to boost resources, and potentially 20,000 years ago, even moving around little small mammals as kind of protein packages between tropical islands as a source of food. So really, you can start to see how if humans are able to specialize in these habitats, it's not a great step to then developing this kind of more interactive relationship with plants and animals as well, that would eventually then take us on to food production. And then just to finish with, in the context of the new direction of our own institute, how humans then began to start interacting with even the Earth system itself, given that today we're now in this kind of Anthropocene era where our actions are seen as having a real dominating effect on Earth systems. The question is, given that our origins are really in this ability to adapt to all of these habitats, how are we going to do now we're changing these habitats, tipping the Earth into new states? It's going to be interesting to see where our sort of ability to be flexible really goes from here. So thank you very much. Thank you to everyone, all the funding bodies that support this research, and thank you to you all for listening and for the kind invitation. And as Tom mentions, just some self-promotion at the end. There is an academic book where I explore at least some of the tropical forest areas, and the popular book as well, if anyone's interested in both English and German. So there you go. Thank you very much.